Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. Our topic today will be the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War. We've already discussed the geography and the background of ancient Greece and the very important city-states of Athens and Sparta. And so now we move on to a little bit of warfare that's going to take place between the Greeks and the Persian Empire. You've already learned, and it's been mentioned in past lectures, about the Persian Empire. We'll pick it up in this upcoming lecture with Darius I and the Ionian Greeks. There was a group of Greeks that were living along the coast there in Anatolia, also known as Asia Minor, also known as modern-day Turkey. And they were living along the coast there by the Aegean Sea, but they were still Greek. And we'll find that there will be a rebellion, and you'll learn, of course, I'm just giving you an overview right now. There will be a rebellion by these Ionian Greeks and against the Persians. But it doesn't just end there. The Persians put down the rebellion. The Ionian Greeks are not successful. But the city-state that we've learned about, Athens, will jump into the fray, so to speak, and will burn down the Persian capital there of Sardis, which is in Asia Minor or Anatolia. And of course, Darius I and the Persians are not exactly happy. And that starts the warfare. It's not a continuous war. There are some breaks, of course, but probably heard of the famous Battle of Marathon, where the Persians will be defeated by the Athenians at that Battle of Marathon, which takes place on the Greek mainland. Darius I died shortly thereafter, and the fighting will stop for a while. Problem is, Darius I, his son Xerxes, and I know you've heard these names before, Xerxes takes over the Persian Empire and he starts things back up with the Greeks. We know about the Persian Wars. There is a Greek historian that writes a lot about the warfare taking place between the Greek city-states, because Greece is not united like it is today, and the Persian Empire. And his name, of course, was Herodotus. He also comes to play in a lot of information that we gather throughout this ancient period as well. Well, Xerxes starts the war up yet again. And sends his the Persian army is very powerful. And, the Persians have built this huge empire that spans the Near East up into modern-day Turkey, into Egypt. So they are definitely powerful. They had their soldiers, they would gather from even conquered people. And for the most part, it seemed that their conquered peoples were happy to live under Persian rule, as we've heard in previous lectures. The Persians just demanded they send soldiers and they pay taxes, but they let their conquered peoples practice their own religion and have their own governments pretty much. And so, for the most part, everyone was pretty content under Persian rule, except, of course, those Ionian Greeks. So Xerxes, the Persian ruler at the time, sends his force, and they travel across the Hellespont, which is a narrow body of water that separates Asia Minor from when you start getting into the European continent. And of course, when you're moving such a massive amount of men and supplies, it takes logistics and it takes organization. The Persians actually built a temporary bridge across the Hellespont made of boats that they tied together, and then they simply walked across them. And then they made their way into the northern part of Greece, and then they made their way down. Of course, their target is Athens. They are marching toward Athens. You'll hear about famous battles that have taken place during the Persian Wars, like the Battle of Thermopylae, very famous battle with the 300 Spartans that will not budge even when they are surrounded and they all die. And of course, we already know with Sparta, it was best for them to die, better for them to die than to surrender. And that's what these Spartans did here at the Battle of Thermopylae. They did manage to slow the Persians down, but the Persians will continue making their way to the city-state of Athens, although the Spartans bought the Athenians some time to prepare, which was a good thing. Some of the other battles that you may hear about in this lecture coming up here, the great sea battle of Salamis, just off the coast of Athens, with the Athenian naval commander. His name was Themistocles. Lovely names. A final land battle at Plataea gave the Greeks a total victory. The Persian Empire loses the Persian Wars. And in fact, Persian Empire will never be the same again. This was the beginning of the end for the Persian Empire. And as you've heard, the Persians go through a series of assassinations and intrigues and rebellions and just bad government until, of course, Alexander the Great comes in and conquers the Persian Empire when he goes on his massive conquering trek across the Near East. So you'll learn more about the Persian Wars, and you'll also learn about the Peloponnesian War. Now, the Peloponnesian War is between mostly the leagues that formed after the Persian Wars. Athens wasn't altogether happy. They decided to form a league in order to free the Ionian Greeks, which, remember, had not won. Remember that Darius had put down the Ionians. So Athens wanted to free the Ionian Greeks. They wanted to get some money back or goods back from Persia, kind of like a payment for the war itself. So when they would attack or they'd have battles, they'd maybe confiscate items or some such like that. So Athens is going to become very rich from this league that they've created after the Persian Wars. They have a treasury and they have allies. Problem with Athens, they will force a lot of their allies to start giving them tributes. Athens is becoming an empire. And that little city-state of Sparta, very militaristic city-state that we've discussed, not very happy about Athens and a little worried about the direction Athens is headed in. So Sparta will gather an alliance, the Peloponnesian League, and Athens had the Delian League, and we'll have fighting that takes place called the Peloponnesian War. And eventually, of course, Sparta will win, but Sparta just doesn't have they're not capable of governing diverse areas such as this. And so we'll continue seeing civil war and civil fighting here on mainland Greece for quite some time. So let's find out more about the Persian and Peloponnesian War.
The Persian Wars were fought between Greece and the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was the largest empire in the world in 500 BC. It was enormous. It took in most of what we call today the Middle East, but it stretched from Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, far to the east toward the Indus River in what is today Pakistan. And it also took in areas along the Mediterranean seaboard all the way down to Africa to Egypt, an area that they conquered. The Persian Empire also took in an area in modern-day Turkey called Asia Minor, taking over the Ionian Greek city-states that had established themselves there in the previous century. This empire was ruled by a single king. It was started by Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great conquered several empires, including the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and helped to establish this empire, and subsequent kings came along and added to the vast realm of the Persian Empire. Now, this largest empire in the world would end up invading Greece. Greece, in contrast, was rather small. As a country, Greece is about the size of the state of Louisiana geographically, and it is a country that has a lot of islands. It's also mountainous, so it's a lot different than Louisiana other than the size. The mountainous terrain of Greece led to the political development of Greece, where you have individual city-states or polises. The polis, the Greek polis, is the city, and each of these cities in Greece were independent of one another. The Greek city-states, or Greece, did not have a king. There was no king of Greece like there was king of Persia. The individual city-states operated however they wanted to operate. One might be more of a participatory government like a democracy. One might be more of an oligarchy. One might have a tyrant or a king or a monarchy. So they were vastly different from one another. They did have common language, and they believed in the same main gods, the Greek gods, but other than that, they were separate and independent politically. How one operated was different than another, but they were still in close proximity to one another, living in the same general area. Now, at best, the Greek city-states really didn't get along with one another, and at worst, they were at each other's throats. But they did have one common enemy to an extent, and that was the vast Persian Empire. Again, the largest empire the world had ever seen. In around 500, there began to be some problems with the outer edges of the Persian Empire in modern-day Turkey, these Ionian Greek city-states. One particular Greek city-state rebelled against Persian rule. And when they rebelled, this Greek city-state asked the Spartans for help in Greece. Sparta said no. They asked Athens, and Athens said yes. So Athens goes in to help this little small Ionian Greek city-state in their rebellion against the massive Greek Empire. Now, Athens didn't really have a whole lot to provide to this rebellion, and the rebellion was ruthlessly crushed by the Persians, but it was something that really stuck in the king of Persia's mind, that the fact that that this little city-state of Athens helped out in this rebellion against the Persians. The name of the king of Persia at that time was Darius I. And Darius I decided that he would make a move toward the Greeks and make an attack against the Greek city-state of Athens. Now, he may have been retaliating in some fashion for revenge, but Darius was probably looking to add Greece to the vast Persian Empire. Darius is going to sail across the Aegean Sea to Greece, bringing with him about 40 or 50,000 men and several ships. The Persians are really a land-based empire. They're not really a sea empire at all, and what they do is they are going to use ships that are made by the Phoenicians. So they use these Phoenician ships and they sail over to an area of Greece where Athens is located. The overall area where Athens is located is on the Attica Peninsula, and they're going to land the fleet of ships on a plain about 25 miles away from Athens to the northeast of Athens. This was an area where the Persians could offload their troops and also offload their cavalry, which was a significant part of their army. the cavalry was essential in helping to create this empire, and the plain there at Marathon could be used to offload the cavalry and also to have a place for the cavalry to graze. Now, Athens could have just simply stayed behind its city walls and defended itself that way, but what the Athenians decided to do was to march their army out to Marathon to meet the Persians on the battlefield at Marathon. So that's exactly what they did. They marched out to Marathon and they occupied the hills that surrounded the plain. So they were actually on the high grounds. And they saw the numbers of Persians. And one of the things that happened, the Athenian commander there, Miltiades, is going to send a runner to Sparta to see if the Spartans might be willing to help out the Persians. Now, the Spartans were no friends of the Athenians and vice versa, but they did have this common enemy in the Persians. So Phidippides is going to run from Marathon to ask the Spartans for help. Sparta was about 150 miles away from this battle site. It takes him about 2 days to get there. And when he gets there, he asks the Spartans for help, and the Spartans are going to say, not right now. We're not able to help you, but we can help you with the full moon. Well, the full moon was still 6 days away. So that meant that the Athenians are going to be on their own. Once Miltiades found out that the Spartans were not coming, he waited a few more days, and all of this waiting began to sort of intensify the feel on the plains of Marathon. What the Persians maybe, they're not quite sure about this, but the Persians may have already loaded their horses up on the ships and intended to sail around to the port of Athens. In any event, Miltiades makes his move in late September of the year 490 BC at the famous Battle of Marathon. And even though he's outnumbered, he'll lead the Athenian troops there, and there are some allies. The Spartans aren't helping, but the Athenians do have the help of the Plataeans, who begin to move down off the hills onto the plain and toward the massive Persian troops. And when they go down there, Miltiades orders them to move at double speed, moving twice as fast as they would normally move. And that's where the phrase "on the double" comes from. And the reason that he said that they should move at twice the speed is it wouldn't give the Persian arrows for them to really have a chance for them to reload those arrows, and that would help out the Athenians in their march toward the Persian line. It also meant that they wouldn't be able to gauge how far away they were, the Persians, and the arrows would simply overshoot, in some cases, the Athenian line. But in any way, the Persians were stunned that the Athenians decide to make sort of a run for it and then engage in fighting. And what happens at this battle, Miltiades is going to use his stronger troops for the outer flanks and his weaker troops in the center. And the weaker troops for Athens were actually matched up against the stronger troops for the Persians in the center line. But the Persians are really what you would call outflanked in this battle. The flanks are going to close in and sort of envelop the Persians, and it will be a massive Persian defeat and a stunning and shocking Athenian victory. The Athenian infantry will score, according to Herodotus, the ancient historian, the Persians will have a casualty total of around 6,400, and for Athens it would be less than 200. So it was a stunning victory for Athens in this Battle of Marathon, and one that was completely unexpected to some extent on both sides. Athens had chase the remaining Persians who were on the battlefield on the plains of Marathon back to the Persian ships. At this point, by the way, Miltiades began to wonder if the Persians were not sailing away home to Persia, but maybe sailing around the peninsula back to Athens. And Athens, the city, was not defended because the army was not in town. The army was 25 miles away. The army has to make a rush for the city. They're going to march back to the city after this battle in order to defend it because no one's there to defend it. And when they get back there, they get back just in time. The Persian fleet comes around, sort of around the corner, and when they see the Athenian army there, they decide to abandon their invasion of Athens and sail home. And so this first Persian invasion of Greece is pretty much the Battle of Marathon, in which the Greeks score this stunning victory and sends the Persians packing. By the way, the Spartans are going to show up, but it's after the battle, and when they get to the Battle of Marathon, they kind of want to see exactly what happened and how the Athenians actually won the battle, and they were quite shocked by the ability of the Athenian fighters and the strategy of Miltiades winning the day there. But it is going, you know, at this point, the Athenians and the Greeks in general aren't sure if the Persians are going to launch another attack, maybe the next week or the next month or the next year. What happens at this point is that Athens and their leaders, especially Themistocles, will engage in a military buildup of sorts. Athens will use its silver. There's a silver mine in Attica that they're going to exploit to be able to build a fleet of ships in order to counter a possible Persian invasion, another one. And they will construct in the neighborhood of about 200 of these Greek ships. And these were the Greek triremes. They're called triremes because there's 3 levels of rowers on the ships, and ships are more maneuverable than the Persians used, the Phoenician ships that the Persians used. And what the Greeks also did with these triremes is they had a battering ram at the front that they tipped in bronze. And because the 3 levels of rowers would work in unison with one another, with over 150 rowers in all on the ships, in effect, the ships were like guided missiles, able to move through the water at 7 or 8 knots. That battering ram, that bronze-tipped battering ram, would be able to slam into ships. So that was the construction of this fleet by Themistocles was done after the Battle of Marathon in preparation for another possible attack by the Persians. Now, as far as the Persians are concerned, they're not going to attack immediately. In fact, Darius, the king who launched the first invasion, will die in 486 BC. And then there's an Egyptian revolt that takes place that takes away time from his successor, who is his son Xerxes, who becomes the king of Persia. Xerxes is really tied up in Egypt for much of the time between the 2 Persian attacks. But by the time we get to 480 BC, Xerxes is finally ready to launch an invasion of Greece. And the Persians want to seek revenge for what happened to them at Marathon. Xerxes wants to maybe seek revenge for what happened to his father. And he will put together a massive Persian fighting force of 150 to 180,000 men that will march into Greece. And this is so many, and not only that, 700 ships. Now, the ships were separate than the fighting force. The fighting force would actually march into Greece, and the ships would support the numbers of troops along the coastline. In other words, the troops would be marching along the coast, the ships would follow along the coast as they came down into Greece. Now, if you're going to march into Greece from Asia, you can't march across the Aegean Sea. What you're going to have to do is go around the Aegean Sea, and that's what Xerxes decided to do. But there was one body of water, the body of water that separates the continent of Asia from the continent of Europe, where Greece is. And that's the Bosphorus Strait. And this particular narrow point called the Hellespont is an area of a little over a mile that he's going to have his troops go across. Now, what Xerxes does in order to get all of these troops across the Hellespont is he's going to make a bridge. The bridge is going to be a pontoon bridge. He inserts over 270 ships side by side and then lays across wooden planks in order for the troops and the horses, for that matter, to march across this pontoon bridge. It was said that the seas were so rough at first the pontoon bridge kept tearing apart, and so Xerxes had ordered the Bosphorus Strait to be whipped or slashed with metal chains, and he had done that a number of times, and finally, according to legend, the sea calmed down enough for this bridge to work. And so the pontoon bridge was put together, and over 150,000 men would go across that bridge, connecting the continent of Asia and the continent of Europe. Now, the Persian army is going to march around, and as they're marching around and they start to get to some of the outer outlying areas of Greece, the city-states and the areas to the north began to simply surrender to this massive Persian force. They weren't going to fight them, they just decided to surrender. In fact, out of the 700 polises in Greece at this time, only 40 decided to ally themselves and to form an alliance against this Persian invasion. And of course, the two big players in this will be Athens, and this time Sparta agrees in advance to help out. So Sparta and Athens have an alliance along with their allies in this second Persian attack led by Xerxes. Now, what the Greek strategy was is they were going to try to stop the Persian advance into Greece and toward Athens in the Greek mountains to the north of Athens, a pass called, or an area in the mountains known as Thermopylae. And this, of course, is where the Battle of Thermopylae would take place in 480 BC, and the famous stand of the 300 Spartans. The Spartans are leading this. Leonidas, the king of Sparta, will lead a Spartan force along with allies into this mountain pass. And they had several thousand men, but they were still outnumbered maybe 30 to 1 or more against the Persians. But because of the narrowness of the mountain pass, the superior numbers of the Persians would, to some degree, be nullified. Now, the Spartans and their allies in the pass at Thermopylae would be able to hold out the Persians for a number of days, inflicting heavy losses on the Persians. Day 1 goes by, the Persians can't get through. Day 2 goes by, the Persians still can't get through, even though they far outnumber the Spartan and allied forces of the Greeks. And so they're stuck there in the pass. What happens at this point, a traitor on the Greek side, looking to enrich himself with Persian gold, goes over to the Persian side and informs them of this sort of secret passageway into the pass of Thermopylae. And the Persians were able to use that secret route to surround the Spartans and their allies there at the pass of Thermopylae on the third day. And this is where Leonidas, the king of the Spartans, sends most of the troops away, and he keeps 300 Spartans there in that pass to defend it. Only 300. Now, they pretty much know that they're going to be beaten, and they pretty much know that they're going to die that day. But what they want to do is they want to force more losses on the Persians before they go into Greece. And what the Spartans are doing to some extent is they are thinking about saving Sparta as well, because they think that if Persia gets a hold of Athens and takes over Athens, then they'll just be able to take over all of Greece, including Sparta. So Sparta was trying to stop them there at Thermopylae. And they are going to fight to the death, but the losses on the Persian side will be tremendous, but it will be a victory in a sense for the Persians because they're going to be able to get through the pass. But it does slow them down. That battle there slows down the Persian advance for several days, and it allows the people of Athens to evacuate their city before the Persians get there. Now, the battle, this famous stand of 300, will be this fight to the death, and one of the most famous battles in ancient Greek history. And it's interesting to note that it was a loss by the Greeks, but in some ways it was a moral victory for the Greeks to be able to slow them down and also to fight to the last man. Now, Xerxes does have the pathway opened up into Attica, the area around Athens, and the city of Athens itself, and he will be able to march his army after Thermopylae down into Athens. And when he gets there, no one's there. There's the city of Athens, but the people of Athens have evacuated. They've gotten out of town in advance, knowing that the Persians are coming. Just like when you might know a hurricane is coming, you would evacuate, and that's exactly what happens here. Now, Xerxes is not too happy that everyone's gone, but what he decides to do with Athens is just to simply destroy it. And he begins to destroy the city, leveling it to some extent, destroying the temples on the Acropolis and the temples all around the city and all of the structures. He feels bad about it the next day because that's usually not what the Persians do when they conquer people. They don't destroy the city. He ordered it rebuilt the next day, but by that time it was too late, and also by that time he did have to worry about the Athenians, who were not in Athens, but had begun to occupy those Greek triremes that had been built up by Themistocles over the previous 10 years. Now, what the Greeks and Themistocles wanted to do was to lure the massive Persian fleet. Again, 700 ships. The Athenians only had about 200, but in a way it's sort of like the mountain pass at Thermopylae. If they can close them in a smaller area, then the numbers of ships wouldn't be so significant. And so what the Athenians do is they place the ships offshore in the narrow straits of Salamis, which is a narrow body of water between the island of Salamis and the coastline near Athens. It's only, a little over a mile wide there, but it's a fairly narrow area for these ships to operate in. And the Greek fleet is going to park there. That will that will sort of entice the Persian fleet up into that area, and that's exactly what the Athenians wanted to do. Now, at what is called the Battle of Salamis, fought in 480 BC, this naval battle between the Athenians and the Persians will see the Greek triremes working in unison and working exactly how they were supposed to work, with these 3 rows of men, over 150 people rowing and using the oars to act as a guided missile of sorts, with these bronze-tipped battering rams slamming into the Persian ships. This naval battle lasts all day long, and when it was over, the Persians are going to lose over 200 ships to the Athenians 40, and they're going to lose tens of thousands of men who drowned or were killed in this naval battle. The battle is such a significant blow, Xerxes is going to go home after the battle. The army, though, is still there, left on its own, really, on sort of enemy territory, and they definitely do not have the home field advantage because that army is stuck there in Greece. The next year, the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC. This is another Spartan-led battle against the Persians, and that battle will be decisive, inflicting heavy losses on the Persians. And after that battle, the Persians are going to decide to get out of Greece and to go back home. So this second Persian advance into Greece, starting with the Persians coming around the Aegean Sea, down into Greece, getting their way through the Thermopylae Pass, and then marching down into Athens itself, having this naval battle and this other major battle at Plataea, they're going to be sent packing again. So the largest empire in the world, the Persian Empire, is not able to defeat these Greek city-states that are all independent from one another. Now, at this time, the Athenians and the rest of the Greeks aren't sure whether the Persians are going to attack again. Maybe, again, in a month or two, or the next year, the Persians could come back. What Athens decides to do, and at first they get the help of the Spartans, but the Spartans are going to fade away pretty quick from this. Athens begins to build an alliance system of all the Greek city-states. Instead of waiting for the next Persian invasion to happen to get together an alliance, they form this in advance. And this alliance will be known as the Delian League, which is named after the island of Delos, where this league will be headquartered, or at least the treasury for it will be headquartered. Reportedly, this is where the Greeks believed that the god Apollo was born. It was a sacred island, and it was a protected island by the gods. And so they decided to have the treasury for this league there on that island of Delos. So it gets its name from that. But this league is really going to be led by Athens because they have the largest number of ships. What the different islands and city-states in the league were supposed to supply were men, ships, and money. Some provided men and money and not ships, and some were able to provide all three. But by far, the most powerful member of the Delian League was the Athenians, who had the largest number of ships. And because they were the largest city-state, they will also, over time, be able to use this alliance and really remove Persian presence out of the Aegean Sea altogether. The Persians are going to be forced out of the Aegean area, including many of the Ionian Greek city-states that were once under the empire of the Persians, or in the empire of the Persians. They are going to be liberated from that with the Delian League. Now, as time goes by and the Persian menace is gotten rid of at this point, which happens within about 10 years after that second invasion, the Athenians begin to use the league as really its own empire. They begin to dominate the league in such a way that even if you wanted to get out of it, the Athenians wouldn't let you get out. You had to continue to contribute to it. And after a while, Athens actually moves the treasury from the island of Delos to Athens itself. And all of the money flowing in from all of these different city-states and Greek islands is flowing into Athens. And Athens will use that money to enrich itself and to also rebuild the city, which again was destroyed by Xerxes in that second Persian invasion. So the building projects that would go on in Athens would be fueled in large part from the money coming in. And again, you weren't allowed to leave. The motto really for the Athenians was no cession. You couldn't leave. And if you tried to leave, Athens would just simply force you to stay. And many of these Greek islands did not want to go up against Athens because of their maritime power. They pretty much ruled the Aegean Sea, and the islands, of course, needed trade. They needed things to come into the island, including food. So they wanted to make sure that the people who ruled the seas were happy. So they stayed in the league even if they didn't want to. If they tried to get out, they would be forced to stay in by force by the Athenians. All that money flowing into Athens rebuilds and establishes things like the Parthenon, which is built during this time. During the time of the Delian League, it becomes the time of what you would call the Athenian Empire. Athens really makes an empire out of this league. They control the league, and that money flows back to the capital in Athens. The Parthenon building, which is a temple to the, which is one of the most famous structures, still standing there on the Acropolis in Athens, is one of the most expensive buildings in the world at that time to build. It's a temple to Athena. The person in Athens, the leader in Athens who is in charge of the Parthenon is Pericles. And during this time of great wealth and building in Athens, Pericles will dominate Athenian politics. Not only building the Parthenon, but other temples, other building projects. Also, he expands democracy, which makes him more powerful. He expands democracy by allowing people in Athens to, the participation age drops down to 18, and everyone can pretty much vote in the Athenian Assembly. The Athenian Assembly, this was really of course today we have what we would call a representative democracy. This was more of a direct democracy where you can actually go to the assembly and vote directly on all the laws rather than have a representative vote for you. And all of the males, of course, over the age of 18 were able to do that in the age of Pericles. And it was a time of great wealth too for Athens because all that money coming in, and the population of Athens is going to explode at this time as well. By far the largest of the Greek city-states. Now, as Athens begins to grow in power, Sparta, who was never part of this Delian League, begins to grow worried about Athens and the power that it has generated through this league. Sparta begins to become more afraid of Athens than it ever was of Persia. They feel that if Athens gets too strong and powerful, then they will simply dominate all of Greece. This whole balance of power theory that Europe had several, 1,000 years later, more than 1,000 years later, where the diplomatic theory was that if one country became too powerful, then they would be able to dominate Europe. And that's why every time Louis XIV, for example, would begin to start wars, you would have a coalition of European countries that would go in and stop them. But in some ways, Sparta worried about the power of Athens becoming so large that they could simply dominate all of Greece. And they certainly looked to be on that way, dominating the whole Aegean Sea area and also dominating some of the land areas of Greece. Now, what happens by the time we get to around 431 BC to be exact, Athens becomes so concerned that you have a war that starts between Athens and Sparta, known as the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War is a war not just between Athens and Sparta, but Athens has its league, and Sparta will also have allies known as the Peloponnesian League, which will be based on the peninsula of Peloponnesus, where Sparta is located. So, in a way, all of Greece is going to be in this fight between Athens and Sparta because the Greek city-states are either on one side or the other. And this war will rage between 431 and 404 BC. And the effects of the war will be devastating for not only the losers, but really for the winners as well. Now, the war goes on for such a long time. The strategy of the war for Athens, knowing that we better not we better not try to go up against the mighty Spartans, because the Spartans are, of course, from birth are trained to be warriors. Their whole society was based on this military state and military rules and Spartan lifestyle of fighting. Now, instead of going up against the Spartan army, Athens decided to close itself inside of its city walls. Even the people out in the countryside throughout Attica, the peninsula that Athens controlled, people were allowed to come inside the city and get out of the way of the Spartans. So the Spartans do come, march out of Peloponnesian and march toward Athens, and the surrounding countryside will immediately be taken over by the Spartans, and they began a process of simply destroying the countryside and taking the crops that were there and then destroying crops if they didn't need it, basically ravaging the countryside outside of Athens. But the people, again, were behind the walls of the city. Now, Athens had these walls known as the Long Walls that went all the way down to the port, which was several miles away. These walls connected the city to the port. Now, what Athens has is this fleet of ships that is able to bring in all the food that Athens needs. So it doesn't matter that the surrounding countryside is destroyed by the Spartan army. They have the food coming in from other sources, mainly the Black Sea area where there's a lot of grain that's grown. So these food supplies, the Spartans couldn't do anything about. They couldn't stop because Athens controlled the sea, they controlled the port, and the food would continue to get in. So Athens, traditionally, what would happen in times where a city would wall themselves in is an army may stay around and just wait for the people to starve to death. But that wasn't happening in Athens because the food was continually being refurbished into the city. What the city does suffer, though, right when the war starts in 430 and 429 BC, is a plague that strikes the city. And the plague, because there's so many people living inside the city walls, because everybody's brought in from the countryside, the plague is going to spread within the city walls and will kill about a third to maybe a quarter of the population, a quarter to a third of the population. What also happens in the plague is that Pericles, the leader of Athens at this time, really the glue for Athens politically, he's going to be a victim of the plague, and he'll die in 429. And so the leadership of Athens will wane. Now, time goes on. What Athens does, though, not only are they bringing in food, they are fighting against the Spartans. Since the Spartan army is over in Attica, what the Athenians do is they make raids with their ships along the coastline of Peloponnesian. And it's not very well defended since the armies are in another part of Athens, and they're able to destroy their crops and inflict damages and so forth. And both sides are fighting it out sort of in this indirect way. Now, the war will drag on, and there's going to be an agreement to try to have to stop the war, and they're going to, for a time, they're going to draw up an agreement to have a 50-year peace. In other words, we're not going to fight each other for 50 years, and that doesn't really work. It only lasts for about 6 years. And eventually, there will be an Athenian leader who comes to the forefront. He's a nephew of Pericles, and really a foster child because he lives at Pericles' house, by the name of Alcibiades. Alcibiades is someone who becomes the leader of Athens, and he's a very persuasive speaker. He's connected to Socrates, one of the students of Socrates, and he will be able to, Alcibiades will be able to convince the Athenians that they need to restart this war against Sparta by attacking a Spartan ally in Sicily, on the island of Sicily. Sicily's the largest island in the Mediterranean. Of course, it's off the coast of Italy. It's part of Italy today, but at this time, Greeks lived there. There was the island of Sicily, and there was the very important, powerful city of Syracuse. And Alcibiades had convinced the Athenians that if they launched this invasion against Sicily and Syracuse, that they could gain control of the island and use that as a resource and really make it part of their empire. And his persuasive skills will be such to where Athens will vote on building a larger fleet of ships and training men and eventually setting sail in around 415 BC, setting sail for Sicily. Now, in the meantime, Alcibiades, who has none of the virtue of Socrates and not nearly the integrity of his foster father, Pericles, this guy's really vain and in it for himself, and seeking glory for himself and not Athens. But he's very manipulative and very persuasive. And he's also famous because he won the chariot race at the Olympics. That's when, of course, they used to have chariot races. So he was well known for that, and that played into his power a bit. But this whole expedition to Sicily was a complete disaster for Athens. It's launched in 415 BC, and then 6 months later, word comes back to Athens that they need reinforcements. And then more time goes by, and then nothing is heard. And then what happens in 413, there's a sailor that shows up in Athens to get a haircut, and he begins to tell the story of what had happened in this faraway land to the navy that he was part of. And he was telling the story of what happened to the Athenian fleet, about how they got pinned down in Syracuse right from the start, about how the generals squabbled with one another, how everyone had a different opinion about how to do things, and things did not go well. And it was a disaster in Syracuse. Athens lost more than 200 ships, really a couple of fleets of ships, over 40,000 men. It weakened Athens tremendously to the point to where they really couldn't hold their empire, their league together anymore, and they were weakened quite a bit. Now, from this point, Sparta will be able to gain access to ships by going to the Persians. The Persians will provide money and ships to the Spartans, and also men to the Spartans, for Sparta to have their own navy. What Sparta needed to do to stop the ability of Athens to survive, even though they were walled up in the city walls, was they needed to destroy their fleet. And even though a lot of it was destroyed at Sicily, they still have fleets of ships that are continuing to supply the city of Athens. Now, the Spartan general Lysander, the admiral who leads the now Spartan/Persian navy, will finally meet up with the Athenians, who make a tactical blunder in a very narrow passageway in the Bosphorus Straits between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. And in this battle, in 404 BC, August Potamoi is the location of the battle that takes place. The entire Athenian fleet is destroyed, and these grain ships would not make it back to Athens. And it meant that Athens now was starving to death. And because of that, Athens will finally have to surrender in 404 BC. And the point of surrender, as far as Sparta is concerned, Sparta wants Athens to get rid of all of its sources of power. One was the league, the empire that it had, which had to be disbanded. Another point was the fleet that they had, which had to be destroyed. Sparta let Athens keep 12 ships, but that was all. And the other thing that Sparta told Athens that it had to do was it had to tear down the walls that went around the city and the walls that went down to the sea, down to the seaport. So Athens was forced to do that. And Sparta pretty much occupies Athens for a short time after that, making sure all of these conditions were met. But Athens will be the loser in the Peloponnesian Wars, and they will be forced to give up all of their sources of strength and all of their power. After a time, Athens does get its independence back. The occupation of Athens will end by Sparta, and democracy will try to come back. But democracy is not very well received even by the Athenian people, because many of the Athenians believe that it was democracy, that direct democracy, that led them down this path to losing the war and really this path of destruction because of Alcibiades, for example, getting the approval to launch this invasion of Sicily, which weakened the Athenians tremendously. And so people began to question democracy. Democracy itself is weakened. It never reaches the high point that it had under Pericles. But in reality, all of Greece is going to be weakened after the Peloponnesian Wars. All of the Greek city-states, whether you were on the winning side or the losing side, will be in a weakened state. And the bickering and the squabbling between the city-states would continue even after the Peloponnesian Wars. Sort of a cycle of violence, a cycle of revenge that would take place between one city-state and another. And playing sort of the puppet master in this was the Persian Empire, who was only too happy to play one city-state against another because a weakened Greece was better for Persia. And so the Persians would actually get one Greek city-state and support it in its effort against another Greek city-state, and sort of the wars and the bickering would continue for decades after this. And all of Greece is going to be weakened. The city-states are not united. They're continuing to fight one another. They continue to remain independent of one another. And the Persians do not have to worry about the Greeks. And what they do have to worry about is another group of people from an area known as Macedonia or Macedon, which is a Greek-speaking area to the north of the Greek city-states. And this was a backwoods area. As far as the Greeks were concerned, these people were almost barbarians. They had been fighting the barbarians so long up there that the rest of the Greek city-states, like Athens, considered them barbarians themselves. But they're going to get their act together very quickly under the leadership of Philip II, who becomes king of Macedonia and establishes really new military tactics and military technology that will enable him to not only conquer Macedonia, but lead an invasion force down into Greece. It is his dream and his goal to unite all of the Greek city-states. And in the weakened state after the Peloponnesian Wars, that is exactly what will happen. The Greek city-states will fall, not to the Persians or not to the Spartans or the Athenians or each other, but they're going to fall to the Macedonian king, Philip II.
Well, it seems that Herodotus was the historian for the Persian Wars, and an Athenian historian by the name of Thucydides wrote a lot about this Peloponnesian War that you've just learned about in this lecture. So as you've learned, Sparta, of course, wins this Peloponnesian War. Now, for our next lecture, we'll talk about Hellenic art and literature, Hellenic meaning Greek. So if you hear the word Hellenic, you can replace it with Greek. Greek art and literature, same thing. Until next time.